Okay, we're going to continue in our discussion of who becomes a prostitute in the U.S. and talk about the age of drug use and its relationship to prostitution onset. So we see the first drug use among people who go on to become prostitutes being age 15 and a half. And that's younger than the typical American teenager. Regular sexual activity onset is about 16.2 for a person who goes on to become a sex worker or a prostitute. Regular drug use at 17 and a half. First IV drug use, 19.9, and regular IV drug use pretty close after that, 20.2 years old. First prostitution, pretty close right after that. Regular prostitution, about a year later on average. So you can kind of see the relationship between having a dependency and ultimately ending up in prostitution. Now, it's really easy to think that drug use leads to prostitution, and that's not exactly what I'm illustrating with this graph. It makes it more likely, but there are a lot of people who enter into prostitution without a history of drug use. There are a lot of people who have a history of drug use and do not enter into prostitution. So it's really important to remember that just because we have these kinds of sort of correlational pieces of evidence, that doesn't mean that drug use is causing prostitution or any kind of association like that. In fact, one of the more important things that might predict whether a person becomes a prostitute is the age at which they started engaging in any kind of sexual contact. And so what you'll notice is the blue bars are people who went on to become prostitutes, and the red bars are people who are just comparison groups. And so you've got first penile penetration. For the people who went on to become prostitutes, that was 14, whereas for the comparison group, it was 16. The next bars say first consensual sex. So you'll notice that for the people who go on to become prostitutes, that is a year after their first penile penetration. So it's much more likely that a person who goes on to become a prostitute had non-consensual sex for their first contact. And you'll notice that their first consensual sex is about a year younger than the comparison group. The comparison group has their first penile penetration on average at about the same time as their first consensual sex, because for the comparison group, for most of them, their first sexual contact was consensual. For prostitutes, their first was non-consensual, and then they engaged in consensual sex much younger than their peers. And then engaging in regular sexual activity occurs at about age 16 for a prostitute and not until about age 18 for the comparison group. So the experience of having had non-consensual sexual contact seems to be a really important predictor of onset of sexual activity younger, and then engaging in consistent regular sexual activity younger among people who go on to become prostitutes. So again, don't look at it like non-consensual sexual contact causes prostitution, right? Because a lot of people have had sexual abuse in their backgrounds and do not become prostitutes. And a lot of prostitutes do not have sexual abuse in their background. But there's a strong correlation where a lot of prostitutes report having had non-consensual sexual contact when they were younger. So some of the factors influencing the development of a prostitute, these arrows are double-headed because they flow both ways. So like poverty and child abuse, it flows both ways, right? If a family is impoverished, it's more likely that child abuse will occur. When there's child abuse, a lot of times there are other factors that make poverty more likely that are kind of going along with it. So all of this is all interacting with each other. So poverty, child abuse, early sexual initiation, drug addiction, all of these interact with each other, and they can lead to engaging in a life of prostitution. So there are a lot of places. One thing that's nice about this image is that there are a lot of places that maybe interventions could occur and make it less likely that a person would enter into prostitution, especially unwillingly into prostitution. So that's good news. Like maybe if one thing were different, then they'd have more options or something else that they might want to pursue. The downside is that because it's kind of a constellation effect where multiple things work together to produce the outcome, there might be even some things that we haven't identified that might be contributing to the outcome of prostitution as well. So even if we were to, let's say, cure all the things that we see on this screen, we may still have people who enter into prostitution unwillingly, and we may discover that it's actually, there are still some other factors that are contributing to that. All right, so what types of prostitution are there? Well, there are streetwalkers, and I think that's what typically pops into a person's mind when they think about prostitutes. And this is probably, one of the most dangerous ways for a woman in particular to be a prostitute, because she's out on the street. Things can happen. She could be, a lot of times the streetwalker will get in the car of the John and go to a secluded place, and they can be victimized, attacked. And, most streetwalkers have some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder from things that have happened to them while they were on the street. A lot of times streetwalkers will have pimps that supervise them. And if they aren't making enough money, if they disappear from the street and don't return with some kind of money, the pimp can severely punish the streetwalker. So there's this control component to this lifestyle. Call girls are in a relatively enhanced position because a lot of times call girls work through escort services where they may have legitimate escort services are technically legal businesses. The premise of an escort service is that you can hire someone to attend a party with you or a play or something, so that you don't have to go by yourself. And the function of an escort service is to give you a companion for the evening that is not supposed to include sex or anything like that, that has, no strings attached. You're not forming a relationship with this person. You're just going contractually to this event. And it's supposed to be just companionship. Call girls are usually under that sort of institution, that sort of business or organization. And call girls are then expected to engage in sexual activity as part of the event. And so call girls are technically not legal in most states and municipalities in the United States, but it's hard to kind of track them because they oftentimes are working under these legal situations called escort services. Call girls have a better lifestyle than a streetwalker because call girls are hired. They typically will show up for the event or whatever, and they have a lot less risk of being out on the street, things like that. But anytime the call girl is alone with the client, there's risk, right? Anytime you're with a stranger in a private place, there's risk associated with it. And so call girls are not immune to the negative things that can happen. It's just a slightly better lifestyle. They tend to get paid more. Streetwalkers are the lowest paid of the female prostitutes. Call girls make a lot more, but they also are, they will spend more time with the client. They'll spend hours at the event, maybe spend the night with them afterwards and things like that. So it's a bigger time commitment. Brothel workers, sometimes they actually live at the brothel. Sometimes they just come in and they have their, assigned room for the day where they work. But brothels typically are supervised by a madam. A woman will typically be in charge of the brothel. And then usually there's some kinds of security on site to try and protect the women from any kinds of assaults or anything like that. Sometimes brothels will be very careful about screening for sexually transmitted infections and things like that. Sometimes brothels even have daycare provided and other kinds of workplace benefits for the women who work there. It's almost exclusively women who work at brothels. I think I hit on all the characteristics of a brothel. And then there are male prostitutes. They're oftentimes referred to as hustlers when they're streetwalkers, because they are on the street and they have to hustle, right? They have to, sometimes they'll engage with sexual contact with a male client, even though the hustler themselves is not actually gay, because they're trying to make money, right? So they're not really too concerned about who their client might be. The typical client of a hustler is, in fact, a male John or customer. Rarely do women seek out sex for money, as the client. It's almost always men who are seeking out sex for money as the client. And so even when the prostitute is male, the client is most likely going to be male. There's also a category of male prostitute called a gigolo, is one term, and you guys have probably heard of it. Or sometimes people will call them male escorts, when what they really mean is a man who has sex for money or for support with a woman. A lot of times, gigolos will have women who keep them in an apartment and pay their rent and buy them clothes and basically take care of the male prostitute whose job it is to, go places with the woman. She might even in fact be married and not even want him to go places with her, just wants to have, trysts with him. And so she'll take care of him in those ways. It's much less likely that a woman who's hiring a male gigolo would pay him in actual cash, but would instead do these, pay your rent kinds of, buy you a car kinds of situations. I think you guys probably wouldn't be surprised if I told you that, that kind of gigolo situation is very rare. Most women do not pay for sex with any kind of male prostitute, but it does happen. It's just really rare. Now, just for a little lighter tone, I'm going to have you watch this CBS Sunday Morning piece on being a male escort. And this is the male escort in the kind of way that I was describing earlier, where you literally are just there as a social companion, not with an expectation of sex. So I'll let you watch this up next in the playlist, and I'll see you on the other side.